Welcome to European Union Governance and Policy Challenges, an online training from the University of Washington. This training was co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and was produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies. Okay, we're going to sit down today and talk about the European Union and agriculture, and the EU and the Common Agriculture Policy, which is the cornerstone of the EU's approach to agriculture over the long term. We're going to start by looking into the EU as an agricultural community, and agriculture and its associated subsidies and subsidy schemes have been at the core of the EU's development from the very beginning, from the Treaty of Rome onward. The question of how agricultural subsidies were going to be handled and unified to create a single market. So it's essentially impossible to create a single marketplace when you have wildly differing schemes for agriculture subsidies, payments to farmers, and just throughout the entire process. If that's not relatively stable and unified, the single market was never going to happen. Today, agriculture represents between 1.5 and 6 trillion euros of the EU's total GDP, depending on what you're counting and how broadly it's defined. There's all the traditional agricultural products like grains, vegetables, fruit, meat, and dairy products, but there's a wide variety of other things, including wood and paper, that are just a very slow agricultural crop, the one that harvests every 10 or 15 years instead of 2 or 3 times annually, like for some of the other crops. And there's also derivative products that come from agricultural products but are not strictly an agricultural product themselves. Great examples are wine, beer, and spirits that come from barley and hops, grapes, potatoes or corn or whatever the other original product is that's fermented, and then are turned into traditionally a much more valuable and high-margin agricultural product. One of the challenges we have is the question of at what point to measure the value of an agricultural product. Do we measure the value of a kilo of grain leaving the field? That's relatively low. It's not a high-value product at that point. How about the value of a loaf of bread made from that grain? That's considerably more valuable on a per-kilo basis than just the grain was. But is that the correct place to measure what the value that came out of the field was? Or should we measure the value of a completed ham and cheese sandwich with lettuce and tomato and bread and meat and cheese that's being sold at the Frankfurt airport for 25 euros? That's a considerably higher margin, higher value product, but is that really the value of the agricultural sector, or is it just value added along the way through the supply chain? So that's one of the reasons why this question of what's the value of the sector is so variable. You really need to just kind of make a decision about what you're trying to measure and make sure that what you're measuring and what you're trying to understand match up well. It's also important to remember that, just like that example, agricultural products are often critical precursors or building blocks for drugs, underlying ingredients, or other contributors to industrial products. They're used just across the board, whether it's in glues or as ingredients for a larger steel smelting process or whatever. Add-ins, additives, ingredients get made from things that started growing in a field and develop along the way. And so they show up at very interesting and complex stages in the supply chain that are not always obvious. So why does government care about agriculture at all? Why is the government involved in this? Why is this not just an open free market process? And the answer should be fairly straightforward, that particularly on the food side, but also on this critical ingredients or precursors side, long-term stability and security for food in particular, but also the larger economic sector, is a critical area of government involvement. And it's a place where price and supply fluctuations are very, very visible and often self-amplifying, where the beginnings of a price fluctuation or a market fluctuation will just make it worse and worse and worse until eventually there's a critical failure. With these outsized impacts across the spectrum, we can eventually lead to choices made in the voting booth, and sometimes governments have fallen when things have gone badly enough in the agricultural sector, or even social unrest at various points in history in modern Europe, including right after the Second World War. So when we look at the EU and their interest in this, we start, as many of these conversations do, after the Second World War, with the rebuilding of the agricultural sector in the original 6 members. And in that case, each country was essentially going it alone and trying to rebuild their agricultural sector and offering various subsidies to farmers to help bring farmers back online, to help modernize their processes. But they were all going about it very differently. And that created a very challenging mishmash and a lot of market discontinuities, where it made more sense for a French farmer to sell some of their goods across the border in the Netherlands or in Belgium or vice versa, because they were subsidized and thus had marketplace advantages over their competitors nearby. It was very clear from the get-go that to have the original customs union, the completely unified internal marketplace for the European Economic Community and its various entities along the way to the EU, that if there was a highly differentiated subsidy or regulatory regime, there was no way to build this marketplace. So creating a pattern of consistency right from the very beginning, along with the original coal and steel community agreements, it was just a necessary part of this development. We've talked before about looking at the formation of the EEC and the single marketplace as potentially being viewed as a way to give Germany's industry access to France as a marketplace and subsidizing French agriculture to be competitive to sell to German customers and across the single market. Obviously, the reality is more complex than that, but it's a very reasonable starting place for addressing the question of why the EU, as we see it today, existed, how France and Germany overcame their various points of contention to reach an agreement that made sense, and remains an important part of the EU's ongoing existence today. When we look at the question of budgets, if we're looking at the EU and the EEC before that, their priorities as a budgetary matter, for most of the institution's life, CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, represented well over 60% of EU's total annual budget every year. You could make the argument that the EU was actually an agricultural union, much more than it ever was a political, a military, a peace project. If we look at what they actually spent their money on until the last decade or so, the answer was agricultural subsidies and agricultural schemes. Today, the CAP is about 55 billion euros a year. It represents still about 30% of the EU's total budget. That's down over the last 15 years or so from over 50%. And there's kind of 2 sides to the modern CAP. One is agriculture and subsidy specific, and then the other is a real emphasis on funding rural development that helps less developed areas within the EU and within EU member states to increase employment, increase job training, to help create new and more modern agricultural patterns and tools, bring in higher compliance and more economic or more environmentally appropriate tools, and remove market distorting subsidies. So when we look at the agricultural market, we see that it has some unique features, and they really help to explain why we are where we are today. Because of the long cycles from planting to harvest, even for normal crops, and particularly for long lead crops like timber, the agriculture market is relatively non-responsive to market forces. You can't go out and grow more wheat just because bread has become very popular this fall and everybody is making toast. You have to live with the amount of wheat that you put into the ground 6, 8, or 9 months ago, depending on where you are. And that's the amount you have. If you need more than that, you need to get it on the global market and just take whatever the spot price is or whatever the availability is. Similarly, weather and climate effects mean that most farmers, at least within a region, are either going to have great crops or a very poor harvest all at the same time. If the weather is great, they'll grow a tremendous amount of whatever their category of product is. And if the weather is poor, there will be very little. Troublingly, one of the features of the marketplace is that farmers can go out of business either by not being able to grow enough of their product to sell, or by growing so much that the price collapses and they're not able to make a profitable amount of money per weight of whatever they're selling. So there's tremendous risks, existential risks really, on both the supply and the demand side for farmers. This boom-bust cycle is incredibly dangerous, both for individual farmers in the short term, but also for the larger marketplace in the long term. Without something to stabilize this, farmers tend to go out of business and in droves, not just one or two at a time, but they're really driven out of the marketplace, either through an excessive boom or an excessive bust cycle, many at the same time. And then, of course, it's very hard to return to the marketplace because it would require substantial reinvestment to start over, and participants driven out of the marketplace aren't in a position to do that. We also have the problem that on the demand side, it's not very price elastic either. It's hard to sell more milk just because it's a little cheaper this month. So if you end up in a high production cycle and the cows are producing a tremendous amount of milk and the price goes down, it's very difficult to convince people to use more butter or more ice cream or more milk in droves just because the price is a euro or two lower per liter. And so it's a real challenge. Milk can't be stored very effectively over long periods of time. And so smoothing out the production and the marketplace ends up being a critical feature of the market if you want it to succeed over the long term. So with these features, we see that it's a natural place for government or structural intervention. These are critical social stability items: milk, butter, bread, true essentials across the board. These built-in natural boom and bust cycles. The reality that both positive and negative cycles, perhaps uniquely to agriculture, can leave farmers in existential levels of financial distress. And there's both a short and a long-term element to stability that in the marketplace that are critical to its success. So what do we see? We see a couple of things that tend to happen, and these have happened both in the EU and in the US and in other parts of the world. And the first instinct is to create a scheme that fills the gap between the market price and what a profitable price for the farmer is. So if the farmer needs to be getting 2 euros per kilo and the market price for whatever reason is 1 euro per kilo, the government agrees to fill in that euro for every kilo they bring to the marketplace. That's fairly effective, it's straightforward, and it does a great job of stabilizing prices for the farmer and giving them a predictable marketplace to sell into. The problem is it encourages vast overproduction, since they're now getting a guaranteed profit per kilo that they bring off the field that without any regard at all for market conditions. What ends up happening is they're incented to produce and produce and produce and get a profitable price for every kilo after kilo. And this is one of the ways where, again, both in Europe and the US, we've ended up with vast oversupply and sometimes having to pour out literal lakes of milk or let piles of grain rot because there isn't even room in the silos, all of which the government is paying for, and it drives the market price down, and it means the government then, or whatever the subsidy scheme is, has to pay for a greater gap because now the market price is 50 cents a kilo instead of $1 a kilo. The government has to make up the full difference to 2 kilos. And it ends up being a negative cycle that just gets worse and worse and worse, and leaves the marketplace in a terrible place for everybody but the farmer. So the natural response to that problem is creating a quota system where farmers are given a particular amount that they'll be subsidized for, at which point they very quickly say, now you've distorted the marketplace and I'm only allowed to sell a certain amount. The traditional solution for that is to guarantee them a subsidy for however much they grew the previous year, or an average of the last 5 years, or however you want to end up doing that. So now you're actually literally paying farmers to not grow a product because it's far simpler and far cheaper to not go through the rigmarole of having them actually produce the product that there isn't place in the marketplace for, and bring it and try to bring it into the market where we know there isn't room for it. It's much more streamlined for everybody to just give them their euro 50 or euro per kilo that they would have grown without actually going through the process of growing it. It's also better environmentally. It's better for the marketplace. It helps make the market a much more stable place in the long run. But it does create a political problem where they're being paid to not do something. It can be a little bit of a challenge. It's also worth noting that that scheme locks out new market participants because they're not getting a payment for the historic overproduction that they're not growing now, so they can't compete effectively. This is a scheme that ends up with less consumer-side distortion, but much, much greater distortion on the production side of the whole scheme. The follow-up to that tends to be tradable quotas, where new market participants can buy part of someone else's quota to try to gain the benefits of being in the marketplace. But all of a sudden now there's a complex secondary market and quota allocations. You don't need to sort of really stay on top of all of these different options. But it's worth noting that they've all been tried on both sides of the Atlantic and around the world. Each has some benefits and creates some real market distorting problems. And it's something that we're trying to get away from in most policy decisions as we're sort of moving into the 21st century here. So the modern trends are away from these market distorting direct production based subsidies, delinking farm supports from either market price or production. And the EU is a global leader in moving towards a more compliance based model where single payments are tied to sustainable production methods and environmental compliance, and farms are essentially getting paid a subsidy just for existing. The scheme differs a little bit from country to country within the EU, but often largely on the basis of what we in the US would call acreage, but per hectare in the EU. And this actually seems to be a fairly successful model that gives a reasonably high and stable and predictable subsidy level for the farmers and supports their long-term stability without quite so heavily distorting the market, at least internally within the EU. There's a significant concern that the subsidy approach locks out developing nations, which would normally have a significant competitive advantage based on lower labor and land costs, but without access to the EU subsidy, non-EU countries often have a very difficult time selling agricultural products at competitive rates within the EU. It's also worth noting that this is an area where the US lags significantly behind. Our subsidy schemes are still relatively market distorting, and that's conceptually something the U.S. Department of Agriculture is trying to do a little better at, but the EU has definitely moved solidly ahead on this. So when we look at the European Union as a global actor in the agriculture space, we can see they're clearly taking a leadership position on the economic impact side, and that is very much to the good. There are still real challenges within the EU. The subsidy schemes for the original 15 members and then versus what newer members are receiving, and long-term parity within the EU. And there are also real challenges about the fair administration of CAP and CAP-related programs within the EU. There's a lot of work still to be done, and I'd like you to hold in mind the tension between the EU's tremendous success at taking a leadership position here and the idea that there is still considerable work left to be done. There's about 100 other subtopics we could really dive into, which are very interesting, but we're not really get into today. But they range from protected designation of origin questions, where champagne is the only sparkling wine allowed to be called champagne if it's from the specified Champagne region in France, or particular cheeses or other products. Greece is always extremely unhappy that feta cheese is not a PDO item. They feel very strongly that only feta produced in Greece should be allowed to be called feta, and they would love to have the right to sue everyone else in the world who makes something and calls it feta, because they believe it can't be feta if it doesn't come from Greece. But the EU has not so far been willing to give feta a PDO designation. We could talk about genetically modified organisms and concerns within the EU about GMO production and GMO contamination of the food supply. We could talk about food safety regulations. The US has had a very hard time selling chickens in the EU because our chickens are washed with chlorine for food safety. And the idea of chlorinated chicken has become a very, very popular concept, and it's resonated within the EU public to the point where they're probably unwilling to take U.S. chickens, chlorinated or otherwise. These things get very complicated, and sometimes the science is great, and sometimes the science is a little more challenging. But because it's also a public marketplace, and particularly for food, the question of what the public is willing to buy and consume becomes a huge issue. That takes us right to the ugly fruit question, where both the EU and the US have very detailed regulations on what you're allowed to sell in a certain category. For a long time, in most of the EU, you couldn't import fruits that didn't fit the correct description, either because they were malshapen or not the right size. Kiwi fruit, for example, had to fit through the kiwi ring. They couldn't be bigger than a certain size, and they also couldn't be smaller than a certain size. So tiny kiwi fruit or strangely kind of half-size kiwi fruit were not allowed to be sold as kiwi. And that's a challenge everywhere. In the U.S., the question of what particular species are allowed to be sold at market as a cabbage. There's the species we're familiar with, but what happens if somebody comes up with a new cultivar and wants to call it cabbage? The regulations in the U.S. for what's legally a cabbage run about 25 pages. And so the level of detail you can get into on any subtopic here is just tremendous. And trying to understand what's really happening at a detailed level is probably beyond what most of us are going to be able to get into. It's just worth knowing that as we kind of bounce over the topics here, each one contains an incredible level of detail when we start really looking at policy and execution on a daily basis. Okay, so that's pretty much it for our initial look at EU agriculture and CAP. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this European Union Governance and Policy Challenges lecture, co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and produced by the Center for West European Studies and the EU Center, a Jean Monnet Center of Excellence in the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies.